Hello and welcome to Indus Special. I'm Meshal Malik. For decades, the world has often looked towards the Western and European spheres for setting an example of free speech and liberty to express themselves. These values have been enshrined in constitutions and laws of different countries. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 19, also enshrines the right to freedom of opinion and expression. Despite this, the world has witnessed the stifling of freedom of expression across these democracies. Of course, the conversation of freedom of expression often demands of us to also look at developing countries. However, given that Western democracies have the benefit of maturity and have had centuries of time for the process of trial and error, the fact that freedom of expression is still an issue warrants an insightful debate. We welcome our guest, Barrister Francis Hoare, who specializes in law of public and human rights, and Taimur Rahman, who is a professor of political science at Lahore University of Management Sciences. Thank you so much for both joining us. Barrister Francis,
Hello.
Let's start with you. So do you think freedom of expression is a myth or is it reality?
I think it is reality. I can only speak from my experience as you say, a barrister in England and Wales. I, in addition to practicing in public law, I've also had some background in criminal law. And there is an element whereby the criminal law can intervene, even in, as you say, Western democracies with ingrained rights of freedom of speech, that no right is at that, and in particular that right is not absolute. So I think there are issues, and I think particularly there are issues in academia, in universities, and amongst students, and so I don't think the problem is largely one of law. I think the problem, to a certain extent, is self-regulation amongst within certain areas and within, as I say, universities, and the pushback on attempts to engage in free speech within the media as well. And I think there have been some examples recently where certain groups have objected to the expression of freedom of speech, both in universities and in the public sphere. For example, in debates that happen online, on Twitter, and in other public spheres, in newspapers and magazines. So I don't think the problem is one of law, but I think there is a problem of acceptance of freedom of speech within the West and including in Britain. And I think that is something that perhaps needs to be addressed.
Mr. Francis, so you're saying that it's more of a problem of self-regulation and self-censorship as opposed to something coming from the end of legal spectrum?
I think probably self-regulation is perhaps to express it wrongly, because I said that. I think the issue is an unwillingness to accept freedom of speech within certain areas. There has been, especially in the United States, but this has come to be seen in Britain as well, an unwillingness to engage in what theme of speech and areas of discussion which are very controversial, particularly in universities. So we have seen in Britain, and this is very much an issue in the United States too, protests and attempts to stop debate of certain individuals whose opinions are disagreed with or unliked. And clearly there are parameters whereby we do not allow speech. So for example, it is not permitted to be defamatory against an individual. It's not a criminal offence, but it's something that can result in legal action and for slander and libel. That is a restriction on freedom of speech. In addition, it is impermissible to incite violence, incite racial hatred. So those are and incite hatred for other reasons. So those are parameters whereby the criminal law and civil law intervenes. But the dispute and the unwillingness to accept freedom of speech, particularly in universities, has been much wider than that. and has engaged areas of debate which are simply found to be uncomfortable or people find objectionable. So rather than an objection on the grounds that something is insightful to criminal behaviour, which would be illegal, there are objections on other bases, and so I think that is potentially a problem, not a problem of the law, but a problem of the reaction to speech within, as I say, particularly universities.
Barrister Francis, you mentioned here how there is action in universities, and that's a very important point. But before we move on to that, I'd like to set the premise, cement it a little more. So for that, I'll move to Taimur Rahman. Mr. Rahman, how important are laws that protect freedom of expression to the conception of Western and European democracies?
Well, they're absolutely central to it, although the approach that various countries take to it can be different. For example, the United Kingdom has a negative right, that is, that anything that is not prohibited is automatically allowed as far as the law is concerned. Whereas Germany, for example, has an explicit reference to the right of freedom of speech, etc. So I believe now in 1998, Britain also signed something that allowed, that gave certain rights, some certain positive rights, that is, with respect to freedom of speech. But it's been very central to the liberal paradigm since the writing of people like John Stuart Mill and Immanuel Kant, the public use of reason, the standing up against the tyranny of the majority. All of these concepts have been very central to liberal political thought. And it is argued, and correctly in my view, that without the ability of people to disagree with the prevailing opinion, it isn't possible for society to move and develop their opinion, for change to occur and for progressive change to occur. So I think that it's remained central not only to England, but largely even countries that tend to deny the freedom of expression or the freedom of the press, nonetheless continue to accept in principle that this is something that is desirable in principle, although they may then backtrack on that in practice.
Dr. Taimur, so you're saying in principle everyone would like to aspire towards this notion of freedom of expression, but of course we are seeing instances of hate speech, and that's always been a debate to counter freedom of expression. How do we reconcile both of those?
This is not an easy question to reconcile, to be honest, but I think where hate speech leads to incitement to violence, where it leads to racial hatred, incitement to racial hatred, it leads to incitement to terrorism, wherever it leads to a situation where violence is committed against someone else on the basis of race or on the basis of gender or on the basis of nationality, the color of their skin, or some such things, there the law needs to step in immediately. And I think, generally, I think these, as far as the law itself is concerned, although I'm not a lawyer and I'm not an expert on law, but as far as the law itself is concerned, since people have accepted the conventions created by the United Nations and so on, most countries have these sort of laws on their books. Incitement to violence and hatred exists in almost every country in the world. Give or take how it's worded or phrased or understood. And I think where there is clear incitement to violence, or even, for example, slander, defamation, breach of peace, and to some extent, corruption of public morals, or indecency, indecent exposure, all these laws tend to exist in countries and need to be implemented carefully to ensure that citizens' rights are protected and defended.
Dr. Taimur Rahman, you raised an important point. Let's talk a little more about the debate regarding freedom of expression, especially when it comes to the press. Let's take a little look at a video of CNN's chief to the White House correspondent, Jim Acosta, having a spat with Donald Trump.
Your campaign had an ad showing migrants climbing over walls and so on.
That's true. But they weren't actors.
They're not going to be doing that.
They weren't actors. Well, no, it's true. Do you think they were actors? They weren't actors. They didn't come from Hollywood. Right. These were people. This was an actual, it happened a few days ago. And
they're hundreds of miles away, though. They're hundreds and hundreds of
you know
miles
what?
away.
I
That's
think
not an
you
invasion.
should, honestly, I think you should let me run the country. You run CNN.
All right.
And if you did it well, your ratings
Let
would
me
be
ask,
much better.
if I may
Okay,
ask one other question, Mr. President, if I may ask
Peter,
one
go
other
ahead.
question, are you worried?
That's enough. That's enough.
Mr. President, I
That's
was going
enough.
to ask one of the other folks. have
That's
had-
enough.
Pardon me, ma'am. Mr.
Excuse
President,
me. That's enough.
Mr. President, I had one other
Peter,
question,
let's
if
go.
I may ask, on the Russia investigation. Are you concerned that you may have
I'm not concerned
indictments-
about anything with
that you
the
may have
Russian
indictments coming down?
investigation because it's a hoax. That's enough. Put down the...
So that was a video showing of how Donald Trump is treating the press in the United States. Barrister Francis, how has freedom of expression changed after the Trump administration came into power?
I think it's quite important to distinguish between freedom of speech and the way in which politicians speak, decide to speak, decide not to speak. Now, what we heard just then was an example of a politician essentially refusing to answer questions and trying to shut down the questioner. Now, that doesn't and would never encroach against any laws specifically, because the law is to provide for the right for freedom of expression. What really that is an example of is a politician refusing to engage with his public and with the press, and refusing to allow him to be interrogated and questioned about public policy. That's a rather different question to the question about whether or not one is able to speak in public. Clearly, the CNN broadcaster will be able to express his opinions about that interaction, as indeed he did, after it happened. But that's not quite the same as
Barrister
saying,
Francis, on that similar note, Trump has also seen to be accusing CNN time and time again of being fake news. So, of course, CNN has the privilege, has the freedom of expressing themselves, but they are at the same time undermined by a person in power, the president himself. So how does that also reflect a threat to freedom of expression, or in your opinion, that does not?
I think it's a problem. I agree entirely. It's a problem, and I agree that it is unattractive and indeed unpleasant for politicians to attack the press, not because of the way that they are broadcasting, not even because of their opinions, but because they want essentially to shut them down and stop them, or shut down their respect, and for them to be treated with less respect, and for people to assume that they are talking falsehoods when they are not. So that is clearly a problem. But unless there is an attempt to prevent those broadcasters from speaking, from broadcasting, and perhaps from questioning politicians, where I accept that there is an issue there. I don't think that is so much a freedom of expression problem. I think that is a problem with an administration that should be dealt with within the normal means. That is to say, elections, possible impeachment proceedings if things get to a particularly severe state, and so on. But what one does have in the United States is a very finely tuned constitution and a very, very strong protection of the freedom of expression, which is much clearer, in fact, than in other countries which don't have, such as the United Kingdom, for example, which don't have a written constitution and a Supreme Court that can strike down attempts by Parliament to intervene and perhaps, it might be said, restrict freedom of speech. So I don't think it is a problem in the United States in that sense, but I do agree that is a political problem with the particular president we have at the moment.
So, Barrister Francis, you're saying that it is not a problem in this specific instance. Do you feel like it has not been a problem at all in the Trump administration?
As I say, I think that the issue with the Trump administration is, and a number of broadcasters too in the United States, and a number of commentators, is to try and delegitimize certain expressions on the basis that they are false. So that is this fake news allegation, which is actually not just used by Trump and his supporters, but by others, and that, I think, is, as I say, it's an attack using their rights or freedom of speech to attack other speech, but not in a way in which we are used to debating matters, which is by arguing about ideas and facts and the relevance of facts, but by denying that those facts exist when in fact that they do. And that, I think, is, as I say, a political problem and a problem with public discourse. But I don't think it is I don't think it is at the stage where it is an attack on freedom of expression. Exactly, but I do see the political problem, and I do agree that it is something that we should try hard to resist against.
Mr. Rahman, so we're talking about how the United States, the Constitution itself is not problematic. It's an issue of opinions, but the issue of freedom of expression may not just be with the Trump administration. I mean, it precedes it in a way of sorts. For example, in 2016, and this is not to do with the government as such, but when Colin Kaepernick in the NFL took the knee, it became a huge national debate. So it is a problem there. Do you agree or do you not agree?
Definitely. I mean, look, we come from different professions, so we look at this question in different ways. Those from the legal profession will look at changes that have been made in the law. And of course, Donald Trump's administration has not been able to bring about any major changes in the U.S. Constitution that infringe on freedom of speech. But he has been creating a political atmosphere that does infringe on people's freedoms, in my opinion, and does paint them and depict them as, as others and outsiders and so on and so forth. And similarly, I see the rise of the new right across Europe as being very problematic for the same reason. That many times their anti-immigration rhetoric can combine with a sort of a deeply racist views, etc., which can be very problematic. And also I wanted to mention earlier when you said, I mean, there is a massive problem that I see in contemporary civilization, which is, and the West is included obviously in that, but I'm talking about the world as a whole, arguably, which is that the voice of the poor and downtrodden is completely absent in the media as such. So while the possibility exists of people being able to say whatever they want to say or representing their point of view, the reality is that there are 6 corporations that control most of the media, nearly about 90% of the media in the United States, the mainstream media, the broadcasting media, etc. And that means, of course, that that media is very much dominated by corporations, and it's largely the same, frankly, in across Europe as well as in many other countries. So, in a situation where methods of mass communication are dominated by a handful of corporations or a class of people, then you're going to get their point of view. You're going to get the point of view of that class. You're going to get the point of view of the elite, the super rich, etc., and you won't get the point of view of the downtrodden, the poor, the oppressed, the wretched of the earth, and so on. And that, I think, is the
Dr. Rahman, on that very important note, I'd also introduce Izzy Kalman, who's an activist from New York, into this discussion. Welcome to the show, Izzy.
Nice to be here.
Izzy, so on that point, Taimur Rahman was talking about how freedom of expression does not exist for the downtrodden, for the lowest of classes, because media outlets are controlled by a few. What are your thoughts about that?
I don't see where that comes from, because the way I see it, the downtrodden have a very big voice, and there are lots of people talking for the downtrodden. I don't hear heads of corporations calling for actions against minorities. If anything, you hear the news against the people in power and for the downtrodden.
Taimur Rahman, would you like to respond to that?
Oh, sure. Well, I mean, you just have to look at the political economy of the United States and see who owns the media. Of course, it's not going to be the person who owns the media who calls up someone and says, "Oh, don't have that piece of news." It's going to be through the choice of editors and the history of editors and what their ideological proclivities, etc., have been. Where's the news about what's happening with the trade union movements? I worked as a volunteer in the AFL-CIO when I was a college student in the United States of America, and I didn't see labor being adequately covered at all, or labor issues being adequately covered at all. In fact, the sort of Fox News network and these other sort of very right-wing channels have a massive, disproportionate outreach. Even in the US, there have been people who've been writing on the political economy of the media. Noam Chomsky comes to mind, etc. So I think it's quite clear that there is a class bias. It's not just about minorities, it's also about class and how you frame the debate and what debate gets framed and what the propaganda model is, what the dominant narrative is, etc. What can and cannot be included within the debate, who can be invited, cannot be invited. These things are not determined by individual owners as such, they're determined by civilizational choices. But we as individuals are informed by those civilizational choices, and therefore we think that those choices are freely made by us, whereas in fact they've been informed by a history of development, etc. But they disenfranchise and leave out a massive
Mr. Aman, I'd also like Barrister Francis' opinion on this. Barrister Francis, do you think that freedom of expression exists for some people more than others?
I understand where the professor is coming from and why he's saying what he is, but I also note our American contributor and what he said, and I think that the reality is that what freedom of expression is supposed to do in a democracy is to allow a very wide variety of points of view and expressions being published and being available to the public. We have what I do think is still a very good and highly respected organisation, the BBC in the United Kingdom, but also other organisations which have to work within the same parameters of giving representative time for different organisations and different political parties in particular. And that's a legally entrusted right for broadcasters. So, and it depends upon the number of seats that political parties get in previous elections, and it is there to ensure balance. And I think that's very important. I know that isn't the case in the United States, where broadcasters have no duty to broadcast objectively, and therefore you have different networks which produce a different point of view and a different editorial bias, which is reflected in Britain in newspapers, but not in broadcast media. I happen to think that we get the balance right in the United Kingdom. I'm biased, I know, but I think that it is important for broadcasters particularly to express a wide variety of different views and to have a balance and not to have an editorial persuasion that is for one group or another, because the thought is, and I think I tend to agree with this, that they have a particular influence over individuals, because you're broadcasting to people's sitting rooms, to their bedrooms, and that is in a way that they're unable to avoid it if they watch the news, for example, which is very different from deciding to pick up The Guardian, a left-leaning newspaper in the United Kingdom, or The Times or The Telegraph, which tend to be right-leaning. So yes, I do think there would be problems if we had an American system. But I also
Barrister
think
Francis,
that
you've been talking about UK, and you also mentioned previously about the universities and the freedom of expression that exists there. But after 2015 and the introduction of the prevent duty, a set of rules and regulations that are part of a wider anti-terrorism legislation, a lot of universities, a lot of educational institutions felt that there was, in fact, a crackdown, if not a crackdown, then a curtailing of freedom of expression, especially in academia. What about that?
Well, I think that actually the interesting thing is there are two perspectives on this. There is a very strong set of evidence that those people who are talking in ways that are in support of the sort of prevent strategy or against particularly what might be seen as extreme religious viewpoints are prevented.
But what are extreme religious point of views? Because that was supposed to be related to also Palestine speakers. They were not being given the platform to speak out. A lot of universities.
I have to say my understanding is it goes very much the other way, and speakers who speak in favour of Israel are shouted down, are not permitted to speak, and are in many cases harassed. Now, I'm not saying that doesn't happen on the other side as well in some instances, but I think if you look at the dynamics of the way the political pressures in universities in Britain, I strongly disagree that it is those advocating rights for Palestinians that are unable to speak. It tends, in my experience, and certainly the way in which this is reported in the newspapers and the evidence one sees in the press, suggests that it's the other way around. So I'm not entirely sure that that's right.
Is he also on that same point? So talking about in CNN recently fired an employee because of claims of anti-Semitism. So how does that factor into the American debate of freedom of expression?
I'm not sure about the incident you're referring to, but in general in the United States universities, it's very dangerous to express right-wing views. You can express extreme left-wing views and it's fine, but right-wing views, you get bashed for saying them. And certainly Israel is more bashed than any country in the world in American universities. Jewish students are in danger of expressing pro-Israel views in the United States.
They're in danger. Dr. Rahman, I'd like your opinion on that too. What do you think about the debate?
Well, I studied in the U.S. in the 1990s, from 94 to 1998, and it was a very different time period. Today, things have changed quite a bit, quite dramatically. And I really can't say, across U.S. campuses what the Palestine-Israel situation is. But I think it is the case that the Palestinian movement and people who express solidarity with the Palestinian movement have mobilized and managed to have their points of views conveyed, especially on college campuses, not only in the US, but also in the UK. I studied at Sussex University and also at SOAS, and I found that the Palestinian societies there in particular were the strongest. They also had societies in favor of Israel. I think, though, that the question is sort of compared very often to the situation that existed in South Africa in the 1980s, where you had an apartheid state in South Africa and you had many people, boycott, not just South Africa, its products, but also its affiliated organizations and associations. And I think something similar is going on, or at least the left views it very similarly to that this is essentially an anti-racist struggle. Now, anyone who expresses anti-Zionist views within the context of anti-racism is different from people who express anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic views, because people who do express anti-Semitic views that for themselves participate in a form of racism that led to a Holocaust. And so I think that laws that protect people from any kind of racial slurs or racial hatred are justified. And in the context of struggling for democratic rights for the Palestinian people, I think everyone must be careful not to become, not to engage in any kind of anti-Semitism or anti-Jewish sort of rhetoric, because it is prevalent. We know that it is prevalent in the Muslim world, especially. And I think I find that just as abhorrent as I find any other kind of racism. And so I think if it is, although obviously what Zionists may want to prove is that every statement against them is anti-Semitic rather than anti-Zionist. So that it remains for people to judge whether it falls on this side of the divide or that side of the divide. But if there is an instance where it clearly falls on the side of anti-Semitism rather than on the side of a political struggle for the equality of all people, or a criticism
of
Israel
thought,
on the foundation of
Mr. Rahman, we'll get back to the university campuses debates. I'm interested to know more about the freedom of expression and how, for instance, in the NFL, football players taking the knee during the national anthem seemed to be such a national controversy. And I'm specifically interested in this because it's not related to the government, but because to general sentiments. What can you tell us about that?
Okay, I have to admit, I'm not an expert in this. It's not where my interests lie. But personally, I think that making these political statements in sports hurts sports. People aren't listening to sports or watching sports because they want to know the players' political views. They want to enjoy sports, and it's hurting the sports industry.
But isn't every act a political act inherently?
No.
You don't agree with that?
Why is the Yankees and the Mets play baseball against each other? Where's the politics there? Why does it have to be political?
But doesn't a public figure have the right to express what they feel in terms of minority rights, even if it means that they're a sports person?
You can start doing that, but it starts hurting the sports. People are not watching sports because they want to know the political views of the players. It's the wrong venue. It's hurting sports. The sports industry is hurting because of this. Less people are watching because of the politics that's emerging in the sports.
So
it's the wrong venue.
So does that show that freedom of expression does not exist in every field equally? It's restricted to the political domain.
It's not that it's restricted, it's just not the appropriate place. Just because you have freedom of speech, it doesn't mean that it's the right thing to say whatever you want in any situation. If I'm a teacher and I'm teaching material, my job is to teach the material. It's not the appropriate point to put in unrelated political views. If I'm giving a speech someplace, just because we have freedom of speech, it doesn't mean that people in the audience are allowed to start yelling and screaming while I'm talking. It's not appropriate. There are rules. The content of what you have to say is permissible, but it doesn't mean it should be said in every venue. There are the right places to say things and the inappropriate places to say things.
Barrister Francis, do you agree with what Izzy is saying here?
I agree 100% with that. I think that was an extremely insightful comment, because it is absolutely right to distinguish between the legal right to speak and when it is appropriate. And I think it is perfectly appropriate for sporting venues to say that when their sporting stars are on performance, they shouldn't make political statements, because otherwise that will turn what is a sporting event into a political event. If they want to use their public profile in another context to campaign for a particular point of view, of course they have the absolute right to use that profile to do that, and they do. Both in the newspapers, on television, in other sorts of shows and so on. But if they are actually performing, and I think the other context is, of course, that rather like the veneration that we have for our monarchy in Britain on the whole, they have a similar veneration for the flag and the anthem in the United States, and that's a well-known thing. So I can well understand why people do have an objection to sporting stars being seen to disrespect the anthem and the flag. And that's a matter of the United States, but I'm just saying that I understand the context in which there are concerns about that.
We're going to take a short break, and then we're going to continue our discussion with our esteemed guests. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. We're talking about the freedom of expression. Barrister Francis, we are seeing the rise of the right wing all across Europe, but at the same time, in the Western sphere, in Europe and all across the world, we are also seeing the rise of the liberal value of political correctness, which often is seen to be the cause for stifling debate. What can you tell us more about that?
Well, one of the contexts in which this is quite prevalent in the United Kingdom at the moment is about discussion about transsexual rights and proposed reform of the law on that issue, allowing individuals to self-declare what gender identity they have, and that gives them particular rights, or so they would like to enter, for example, women's own spaces. That's an extremely controversial topic, and it's an extremely controversial law reform, and it's a law reform that requires a great deal of consideration of the rival rights of those individuals, and also the rights of women in particular to have safe spaces where they can not be interfered, they can have no men in them, and know that they will have no men in them, and both are very important. The difficulty we've seen is that anyone who speaks in favour of the right of women to have safe spaces are shouted down on many instances, and there are campaigns on Twitter against them, for example, and Twitter has become a pretty important medium for discussions of this nature. And that I think is very difficult because it does demonstrate that the use of public forums such as Twitter to shut down debate by reporting people, by trying to use other users to protest not against what they're saying, but against the fact that they are saying it at all, and rather than engaging in the debate and to delegitimize any discussion on these important issues. I think that's very problematic. And again, it's not. It may get to a sphere where the law should intervene if there is actual harassment against individuals, which is actually a criminal offence in the United Kingdom. But it's very difficult for the law to intervene on that, and it's quite difficult to see how one can deal with that, other than encouraging public discourse which has respect for people's opinions, and where debate is about those opinions and not about the individual's right to say it.
Izzy, on that same point, could you tell us more about what do you think, whether political correctness acts as a facade to, in fact, stifle debate?
Absolutely. There are things that are appropriate to say according to political correctness, and there are views that you can't say, and if you say them, you get attacked terribly. This is rampant in the United States. There's a wonderful book that was published recently, written by psychologist Jonathan Haidt and attorney Greg Lukianoff, called The Coddling of the American Mind. And it shows in detail how the political correctness movement is destroying free debate, how it's hurting students by weakening them, making them fragile, teaching them that certain ideas will hurt them. It's hurting the minds of our young people.
Mr. Rahman, so a lot of people assume and state and argue that political correctness, the rise of the right wing, in fact, is a reaction to political correctness. What could you tell us about that?
Well, before I speak on that, let me just say how wonderful it is actually to interact with people from the US and from the UK through your channel. It's quite nice to hear what they have to say about these issues and being able to say my point of view on that. On the NFL players, very quickly, I think there has been a history where people have used sports stadiums to express their dissent on many important things. Jesse Owen comes to mind. Entire countries have sometimes boycotted Olympics altogether, making a political statement, etc. And there, of course, the suffragist movement and the woman who threw herself in front of a horse and killed herself in order to get women the right to vote, etc. So there is a precedent here. But I agree that you have to every case has to be weighed in individually, and sometimes it is appropriate to make political statements even in stadiums, and sometimes it's not. It has to be weighed. I think there's no blanket statement either way that can serve.
Depends
our
on the
purpose
context.
Here. On the question of the self-selection of genders and the kind of identity politics that it has generated. Although I myself belong to the political left, I find that I'm not in favor of the way in which this debate is being conducted at all. US and the UK has been taken over by postmodernism and post-structuralism. And the idea that genders, well, of course, gender is to some extent socially constructed, but then sexuality or sex is not socially constructed. It's something that is part of our DNA, etc. But the manner in which this debate has been handled now, it seems to me, is indeed leading in a direction which is not conducive to intellectual growth and development. I'll give you one short example. As a teacher, I often say things. I often say things deliberately in a Socratic method. I'll say the opposite of what I actually believe, or what I believe is closer to the truth, in order to stimulate thought, in order to get people to think about those issues, and to advocate deliberately. And I think that's a very useful, not only heuristic device, but also pedagogical device. But also,
Dr. Rahman, since we're running out of time, I'd like your opinion on that specific point. How important is open debate and not political correctness for intellectual stimulation, as you pointed out?
I think, well, the search for the truth is more important than people's feelings on a particular subject. I think I weigh in on that side, that there is such a thing as an objective truth, and we should work hard to get to it, and we get to it only through discussion and debate, even with people whose views we find absolutely offensive. The only line that I draw is that these offensive views are utilized to bring harm to other people by incitement to violence, terrorism, or racial speech, or sexist speech, etc. There, I think it becomes a matter of the state stepping in to protect the rights of other people. Where speech infringes on the right of other people, there I think the state has a right to or even society has a right to temper that speech, to defend, not to curtail, but actually to extend the realm of freedom.
Izzy, on that same point, so how do you see freedom of expression panning out in the coming years? Do you think that there will be more problems that it will have to face?
I will, there's a pendulum, and I think the pendulum is swinging back towards rationality. We've had too much of political correctness. Some of our leading thinkers are talking out against it. So the pendulum is going back the other way towards freedom of expression and not punishing people for their ideas. I think we're going in the right direction now.
Barrister Francis, before we end, I just want a quick comment with you that Hungary has imposed a 25% tax on NGOs that talk about immigration, and how Izzy pointed out that the pendulum is swinging to the way of more freedom of expression. Do you think that this act, something that is going to curtail freedom of expression in Europe further? And where do you think Europe is headed?
Well, firstly, yes, I think that's a very serious attack on freedom of speech. Secondly, I think that is open to challenge in the European Court of Human Rights, which is the instrument that the professor referred to earlier, that we domesticated we introduced into domestic law in 1998 in the United Kingdom. So it could be in violation of its international agreements. But I think that where one gets to tax individuals and groups because of what they are saying, then that is clearly an interference by the state on the right to freedom of expression, and a very serious one. And I would very much hope that any challenge to Hungary was successful, and that they change that law, because it seems to me inimical to the right to freedom of expression. I don't know whether the pendulum is changing in Britain. I hope so, but I'm not quite as confident as our American friends. But I entirely agree with both him and the professor about their concerns about freedom of speech and about its importance. The Socratic method, debate, discussion, ideas, and the free discourse is absolutely crucial to any free society. And I very much hope that the pendulum, as it's said, is going back in that direction.
Taimur Rahman, where do you see the pendulum swinging?
That's difficult for me to say at this point. I think I think concepts of rationality are so deeply ingrained in the West that it's not my view that the political correctness debate has completely dispensed with that view, and the other side is sort of solely in control of rationality. But I will say, with respect to postmodernism, specifically, and where we talk about subjective idealism, that although I still value that as a concept, even when I disagree with it, I do believe that giving root to complete subjective idealism is going to take us further and further away from the actually existing objective truth, which should be the purpose of knowledge, education, and free discussion and debate. So I'm not sure which way the pendulum will swing. It may swing away from postmodernism. That may certainly be the case. But I'm not entirely sure that it will swing in favor of Ben Shapiro and Jordan Peterson and any others. It could go in another direction as well. Let's see.
Izzy, before we end, do you also agree with Professor that freedom of expression is only and valuable for the purpose that it is moving towards the truth?
I agree. The freedom of expression is important for getting to the truth. Yes.
Thank you so much, Izzy Kalman, for joining us, Barrister Francis for joining us, Taimur Rahman for joining us. It was a very insightful debate and a very important one. We hope to see you again tomorrow with Indus Special.